started small, almost laughably. I'd open the fridge expecting to find my lunch for the day, only to discover it gone. At first, I convinced myself it was a mistake. Maybe I'd forgotten to grab it, or perhaps I had absent-mindedly eaten it earlier. But the pattern emerged quickly. Sandwiches I'd packed disappeared overnight, snacks vanished within hours, and even leftovers from my favorite meals were gone without explanation. My roommate, Emma, always had that casual, smiling demeanor, the kind that made her seem harmless even when she was borderline infuriating. She would saunter into the kitchen, cheerfully chatting about her day, while I stood behind her trying to make sense of my shrinking food supply. "Oops, did I eat your yogurt again?" she'd say with a shrug, as if it were some cute, forgetful quirk rather than months of consistent theft. She laughed, I fumed silently, and the cycle continued. At first, I tried subtlety. I started labeling my food, my name in bold marker, little warnings on every container. I even tried organizing the fridge meticulously, hoping that a clearly demarcated system would deter her. It didn't. Emma had a way of gliding through the kitchen, eyes scanning shelves casually, hands grabbing what she wanted, as though she had every right. Every time she opened a Tupperware that wasn't hers, it felt like an invasion. A violation of the small sanctuary I had fought so hard to maintain in our shared apartment. I considered talking to her, casually dropping hints about how my food kept disappearing. But her laughter, her dismissive "oh come on, it's just a little snack" attitude, made confrontation feel both absurd and impossible. If I confronted her directly, she would twist it into a joke, leaving me looking petty and oversensitive. So instead, I started taking mental notes, observing her movements, the way she lingered near my shelf, the times she lingered longer than necessary in the fridge. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Every time I opened the fridge and found something missing, the helplessness deepened. I couldn't understand why she did it. Was it thoughtless, lazy, or deliberate? Each disappearance chipped away at the small trust I had left, replaced by irritation that simmered just below the surface. I noticed subtle patterns. Emma only stole certain items, the ones she couldn't resist: cheese, chocolate, the sandwiches I packed myself. She never went after what was clearly hers. It was almost as if she was collecting my favorites intentionally, feeding on the frustration she knew it would cause. The frustration didn't stay in the kitchen. It followed me to work, to the coffee shop, to every shared moment in the apartment. I felt trapped in my own space, a constant guest in what was supposed to be my home. The anxiety built quietly at first, a low hum that became a nagging, relentless presence. I'd catch myself checking the fridge repeatedly, making mental lists of what was missing, imagining the audacity it must take to repeatedly disregard another person's property so casually. There were nights I'd lie awake, replaying the day's interactions, thinking of ways to prevent future thefts. I considered locking my food, even buying a tiny mini fridge for my bedroom, but each idea felt extreme, almost paranoid. And yet, every time I opened the fridge, I was reminded that my small, personal boundaries were being violated daily, repeatedly, and with no regard. One night, the breaking point came subtly. I had carefully prepared a special dinner for myself, a comforting mix of dishes I loved, and stored it in the fridge. I had been looking forward to it all day. When I opened the fridge after a long shift, the container was gone, replaced by an empty space and the faint, lingering smell of someone else's breakfast. That was it. Something inside me snapped. I wasn't just annoyed anymore. I felt anger, raw and hot, bubbling under the skin. The anger didn't manifest in shouting or confrontation at first. I simply stared at the empty spot, my hands gripping the counter edge, heart pounding in disbelief. Months of being treated as if my boundaries didn't matter had come to a head. This wasn't about food anymore. It was about respect, about recognizing that your own space and possessions should be yours. And that repeated violation, no matter how casual the perpetrator may seem, erodes your sense of safety and fairness. I began watching Emma more closely, trying to understand the patterns behind her audacity. She was always casual, always smiling, always joking when caught. She'd say things like, "Oh, I just thought it was free for everyone," as if months of targeted theft could be brushed off as innocent misunderstanding. But the consistency of her behavior told a different story. She knew exactly what she was taking and exactly when. She had perfected the art of minimizing culpability while maximizing irritation. It was during these weeks of quiet observation that the first glimmer of strategy began to form in my mind. If subtle warnings didn't work, if passive measures didn't deter her, then maybe it was time for a more deliberate approach. Not confrontation, not shouting, not pleading, but a way to turn her behavior into a situation where she couldn't hide, where her actions would be undeniable, and where the tables could be turned without me looking like the aggressor. I started small at first, noting what she gravitated toward most. Cheese, chocolate, my favorite sandwich, bread. Every theft had a predictable rhythm, almost a pattern. I realized that if I could manipulate that pattern, if I could predict exactly how she would act, I could create a scenario where her behavior would work against her. But that required patience, timing, and restraint, none of which I had exercised in months. The helplessness had taught me something critical. Anger alone was not enough. Hasty action would fail. A direct accusation would be met with jokes, laughter, and deflection. No, I needed a plan that was subtle, strategic, and inescapable. I needed to make her overconfidence, her casual disregard for boundaries, her sense of impunity, the very mechanism that led to her own reckoning. For now, I retreated into observation. Every visit to the kitchen, every glance she threw at my shelf, every casual joke about helping herself was logged in my mind. Each detail, each habitual action, became a piece of the larger puzzle. The violation had escalated beyond stolen food. It had become a test of patience, a study in strategy, and an exercise in control. By the end of the week, I had decided on my first step. I would let her continue, let her underestimate me, all the while documenting, planning, and calculating. The sense of helplessness remained, but it was now tinged with anticipation. The tables could be turned, but only if I waited for the right moment, prepared for every possible reaction, and orchestrated the situation with precision. Months of violation had a strange effect. They didn't just build anger, they built awareness. They made me see patterns where others saw coincidence. They taught me that patience can be a weapon, and that observation can be more powerful than confrontation. And above all, they revealed a truth that I had never fully appreciated. When someone consistently disrespects your boundaries, it's not enough to react. You must anticipate, strategize, and reclaim control in a way that leaves no room for denial. I went to bed that night with a mixture of frustration and resolve. Emma had no idea what was coming. She believed her little jokes and casual thefts were harmless, amusing, and consequence-free. She had underestimated my patience, my attention to detail, and my resolve. She had no idea that the very act she thought was mischievous would soon become the key to her own reckoning. And as I drifted to sleep, one thought repeated in my mind: patience, observation, and careful planning would turn months of violation into the most satisfying kind of justice. The next morning, I woke with a lingering tension I couldn't shake. My brain kept replaying the previous week's discoveries: the empty Tupperware, the vanished snacks, the quiet smirk Emma had given me when I confronted her in the past. I felt cornered in my own apartment, my small sanctuary invaded repeatedly, leaving me restless and constantly on edge. Every trip to the fridge became a test of patience, every open cupboard a potential betrayal. I tried subtle strategies first, hoping to restore some sense of order without direct confrontation. I labeled everything meticulously "do not touch," my name plastered on sandwich bags, sticky notes on containers, even gentle reminders on chocolate wrappers. I figured that clear signage would remind her boundaries existed, but the notes became part of the joke. Emma would grin at me, wink, and reply, "Relax, it's just food." That casual dismissiveness, that ability to brush off months of disrespect as if it were cute, only deepened my helplessness. I began hiding certain things, placing my favorite snacks on the top shelf, in containers, behind cans of soup, even inside boxes I rarely touched. At first, this gave me a small sense of control. I felt clever, as if I had outsmarted her in some minor way. But it didn't last. One by one, even these hidden treats disappeared. She seemed to know exactly where to look. And when the evidence of my stealth efforts was gone, I realized just how deliberate she had been all along. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was strategy, and I was being outmaneuvered. The helplessness extended beyond the kitchen. It seeped into my daily routine, following me to work, into my thoughts at night, and into the way I interacted with friends and family. I dreaded inviting anyone over, worried they might inadvertently encourage her behavior or worse, witness the chaos she created. The apartment that should have been my refuge felt like a trap. Each shelf and drawer a battleground where I was constantly on guard, but never victorious. I began documenting her habits in secret, jotting notes on my phone and keeping mental logs. She had certain predictable patterns. She always raided the fridge late at night, always gravitated toward freshly baked items, always forgot her own snacks in favor of mine. These repeated behaviors painted a clear picture of deliberate, unrepentant theft. The helplessness I felt was no longer just about the missing food, it was about the knowledge that I was powerless against someone who had perfected a way to skirt accountability. I even considered discussing it with our mutual friends, hoping that shared awareness would create some pressure, some subtle peer accountability. But that was a minefield in itself. Friends tended to laugh when I explained the situation, calling it roommate drama or just food. No one saw the daily erosion of trust, the stress it created, or the way it had begun to influence my behavior. I felt isolated in my frustration, trapped in a cycle of theft and dismissal, with no ally strong enough to intervene. Days blurred together. I started noticing small irritations that previously wouldn't have mattered. Emma's casual comments about borrowing things, the way she left crumbs in the kitchen as if marking territory, even the way she moved around my belongings without permission, all of it became grating. Every instance felt like another reminder that my boundaries had been disregarded, that my space, my effort, and my patience were invisible to her. I tried reasoning internally with myself. Maybe she didn't realize the impact of her actions. Maybe it wasn't malicious. But every disappearing lunch, every vanished snack, every dismissive grin shattered that possibility. I couldn't ignore the pattern. It was deliberate, repeated, and entirely self-serving. The helplessness I felt wasn't born of misunderstanding, it was born of being systematically disregarded, repeatedly, by someone who had no intention of changing. It was during these weeks of simmering frustration that I began thinking strategically. I realized that anger alone wouldn't solve the problem, and direct confrontation had already proven ineffective. She laughed at my attempts to enforce boundaries, turning my frustration into her amusement. But observation, patience, and careful planning offered a different path. I could turn her own habits against her, create a scenario where her audacity would be the instrument of its own reckoning. At first, I experimented with small tests. I deliberately left certain items in obvious places, observing how she reacted. Would she resist? Would she notice the labels? Or would she succumb, proving that her theft was habitual, almost instinctive? The results were clear. She always went for my favorites, never hesitated, and never acknowledged boundaries. Each test reinforced my understanding of her patterns and the inevitability of a moment where her behavior could no longer be ignored. As the helplessness deepened, a subtle shift occurred within me. I realized that the powerlessness I had felt was not absolute. I might not be able to stop her outright, but I could anticipate her moves, document her habits, and craft a situation where the consequences would be unavoidable. The helplessness, in a strange way, became the foundation for a plan. A blueprint for reclaiming control over my life and my space. I started keeping more detailed records, what she took, when she took it, even the frequency and timing of her raids. I began noticing her routines. She liked late-night snacks, she preferred certain brands, and she had a predictable pattern of leaving minimal evidence that could be traced back to her. Each piece of information was like a thread, weaving together a tapestry that revealed both her audacity and her predictability. The realization that I could convert helplessness into strategy was empowering. I began imagining the perfect scenario, a way to expose her actions without confrontation, without drama, and without losing credibility. If patience had taught me anything, it was that timing was everything. And if I could anticipate her, predict her moves, and prepare for the moment of truth, I could reclaim the power that had been stripped away month after month. By the end of the second week, the helplessness that had dominated my thoughts began to transform into anticipation. I wasn't merely waiting for the next theft. I was preparing for it, observing it, and using it as an instrument for a larger plan. I felt a subtle sense of control returning, not by stopping her immediately, but by understanding her, predicting her, and readying the groundwork for her eventual reckoning. Even as I sat on the couch late at night, making mental lists of what to pack, how to hide it, and how to arrange things in a way that she would inevitably be drawn to, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The helplessness had been deep, real, and suffocating, but it had also sharpened my observation, honed my patience, and prepared me for the moment when her actions would meet consequences she could not escape. Months of repeated theft had not just stolen my food, they had stolen my peace of mind. But they had also taught me the value of patience, the power of planning, and the inevitability of cause and effect. Emma had underestimated me in every instance, assuming that my frustration would remain passive, that my anger would fade, that my boundaries were negotiable. She was wrong, and in that quiet, simmering helplessness, I realized something crucial. The very habits that made her audacious, careless, and dismissive were going to be the instruments of her own reckoning. Every snack she stole, every container she pilfered, every moment of casual disregard was now a thread in the trap I was beginning to weave. By the time I went to bed that night, exhaustion mingled with a growing sense of purpose. The helplessness that had consumed me for months was no longer a prison. It was a guide, a teacher, and a blueprint for action. Emma had no idea what was coming. She had assumed her behavior was consequence-free. She had assumed I was powerless. And soon, she would discover that assumption was the biggest mistake she had ever made. The days after the first few missing meals felt heavier than I expected. At first, I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe Emma was just forgetful, or perhaps she thought it was okay because we shared the apartment. But rationalization only lasted so long. Every time I opened the fridge, my pulse quickened with the creeping anxiety of not knowing what I would find or what would be gone. The helplessness was beginning to consume me, subtle at first, but steadily growing into a constant weight on my chest. I tried everything that felt reasonable. I labeled my food in bold, colorful markers, even adding little messages like hands off or reserved, my name on containers. I rearranged shelves, put my snacks behind other items, hid leftovers inside boxes, and even began locking certain things in the tiny pantry I rarely used. None of it mattered. Emma had a way of gliding into the kitchen, casually opening containers, and taking exactly what she wanted. She never seemed guilty, never hesitant. Her jokes about helping herself only added to my growing frustration. I started noticing patterns in her behavior. She had a preference for certain snacks, my granola bars, chocolate, anything that required effort or money to replace. She knew my favorite items, the things I looked forward to most, and she targeted them with precision. At first, it almost seemed like a cruel experiment, testing how far she could push me before I reacted. And in some ways, she had succeeded. I began walking into the kitchen with tension coiling in my stomach, expecting disappointment, dread, and disbelief. Helplessness isn't loud. It doesn't shout. It creeps in quietly, settling in the corners of your mind, making ordinary moments feel heavier, more oppressive. I found myself dreading simple tasks, opening the fridge, making a snack, even thinking about sharing the apartment with someone I could no longer trust. Nights became restless. I'd lie awake imagining the next time I'd find a missing lunch, a vanished dessert, or an empty container that I had painstakingly prepared. Every scenario felt predictable, yet impossible to prevent. I even tried talking to her, casually at first, in that way people do when they hope for a minor correction. "Hey, I noticed the yogurt disappeared. Can we make sure it stays in the fridge for me? Her response was a laugh, a shrug, and a casual, "Oh, come on, it's just food." That phrase so dismissive, so light, so wrong stung more than any theft ever could. She wasn't apologetic. She wasn't mindful. She was untouchable in her own mind, a puppet master, testing my patience and resilience. The helplessness deepened further as I tried indirect measures. I began strategically buying extra food, leaving small decoys in plain view, thinking maybe she'd go for those instead of my main meals. But Emma was always precise, always selective, and always unconcerned with boundaries. The decoys disappeared first, and my carefully prepared meals followed shortly after. It wasn't just theft, it was psychological. Every act reminded me that my efforts to establish boundaries were meaningless. This helplessness started spilling over into my interactions with others. I hesitated to invite friends over, worried about embarrassment or judgment. How would they react if they saw the apartment as a battlefield? How could I explain months of missing food, small daily violations that seemed trivial but were constant, unrelenting, and demeaning? The anxiety of anticipating the next theft became a shadow I carried everywhere, making the apartment feel less like home and more like a place where I had no control. At work, I noticed myself replaying the day's interactions in the kitchen, imagining Emma's face as she casually opened containers and smiled at me. I started overthinking everything: where I placed food, what snacks I left out, and even whether I should start bringing meals from outside to avoid confrontation. The helplessness wasn't just physical, it was mental. My thoughts circled endlessly, analyzing, planning, and predicting her next move without ever feeling truly in charge. Even the small victories, finding a hidden snack untouched for a day, felt fleeting. The triumph was always temporary, a false sense of control that dissolved the moment she returned from the store or came home from work. I began to feel trapped in a cycle where every attempt to regain power was met with subtle, yet deliberate, subversion. Every smile, every casual remark, every laugh at my protests reinforced my sense of invisibility, as if my boundaries, my effort, and my space didn't matter. One evening, I caught her mid-act. I had carefully hidden a small package of chocolates behind a row of canned goods. I walked into the kitchen just in time to see her hand hover over it, a mischievous grin spreading across her face as if she knew she'd been caught but didn't care. That moment crystallized everything. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't laziness. It was deliberate. She had tested, measured, and exploited my patience for months, knowing I had limited recourse. My frustration and helplessness reached a peak that night. I began taking notes, quietly and discreetly. Every theft, every item, every reaction was logged mentally and occasionally written down. I observed her routines, her late-night raids, the times she seemed hungriest, the exact containers she favored. I realized that in order to regain any semblance of control, I needed more than anger. I needed strategy, patience, and observation. The helplessness that had dominated me could become the blueprint for reclaiming my space. As days passed, I noticed a subtle shift in myself. The constant anxiety transformed into quiet calculation. I wasn't just waiting for the next theft anymore, I was preparing for it. I was collecting evidence, noting patterns, and imagining a scenario where her repeated behavior could be used against her without me having to confront her directly. Every stolen item, every casual remark, every dismissive laugh became part of the data I was gathering. And with it came a faint glimmer of hope. By the end of the second week, I understood something crucial: Emma's audacity, her confidence, her casual disregard for my boundaries. They were predictable. She had created a habit, and habits can be anticipated. Helplessness had sharpened my observation, honed my patience, and planted the seeds for a plan that could restore the balance. The helplessness wasn't gone, but it had transformed into something powerful, the foundation of strategy. And as I lay in bed that night, exhausted from months of stress and weeks of observation, I felt a strange mix of frustration and anticipation. Emma thought her little jokes and stolen snacks were harmless, thought they were consequence-free. She had underestimated me entirely, assuming my helplessness would remain passive. She had no idea that her own routine, her own patterns, were quietly mapping the blueprint for the day she would face the payoff of her actions. The helplessness had deepened, yes, but it had also illuminated the path forward. Patience, observation, and careful planning would soon turn the months of theft into the ultimate reckoning. And I realized then, with quiet certainty, that Emma had set herself up for the moment when her audacity would finally meet consequences. She couldn't escape. By the third week, I had become a quiet observer in my own home. Every trip to the kitchen felt like entering enemy territory. I watched Emma's movements carefully, noting how she lingered over my shelves, how her eyes darted to the containers she coveted most. I started noticing the subtle tells, the way she would glance at my snack stash before pretending to rummage through her own things, the slight hesitation before she reached for my chocolate, the small smirk that always followed. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate actions, a carefully rehearsed routine that had been perfected over months. I began documenting everything, not in a formal way, but mentally at first, logging every theft, every comment, every dismissive shrug. Each incident became a data point, a piece of the puzzle that revealed Emma's true habits. She had patterns, predictable and methodical, and understanding them was the first step toward reclaiming control. Her late-night raids, the specific foods she favored, even the times she pretended not to notice the labels, all of it pointed to a behavior that was intentional. Not forgetful. The red flags were everywhere, if I looked closely enough. She would move things just slightly, not enough to seem suspicious, but enough to signal she had been there. Leftovers I carefully packed for the week would vanish after she returned from work, as if she were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I began setting small, harmless tests, leaving decoy items in plain sight to see if she would take them. Every time she did, it confirmed the reality I had suspected for weeks. This wasn't about food. It was about control, testing boundaries, and seeing how far she could push me. I noticed her growing confidence over time. Emma walked into the kitchen as if she owned it, casually opening the fridge and cabinets with the kind of ease that only comes from repeated success. There was no hesitation, no fear of repercussion. Her audacity had been cultivated over months of unchallenged behavior. That realization stung. It wasn't just the food. It was the power dynamic she had established. She had become the one in control, and I had been rendered reactive, constantly on edge, constantly anticipating the next theft. Small observations added up to a clear pattern. She favored my late-night snacks, especially the ones that were a little more indulgent or expensive. She ignored the decoy items I left out during the day, but could not resist what she knew was mine. Even when I rearranged the shelves or moved containers around, she quickly adapted, almost intuitively, as if she could predict my actions and outmaneuver me every time. The mental toll was real. Every time I opened the fridge or the pantry, I braced myself for disappointment. My frustration was constant, simmering under the surface like a low-grade fever that refused to cool. I began planning mentally, thinking about ways to outsmart her, ways to catch her in the act without confrontation. Patience became key. I realized that if I acted too soon, if I confronted her without the full picture, she would twist it into a joke or deny everything, leaving me looking paranoid and petty. I started keeping more meticulous mental notes, tracking not only what she took, but how she behaved afterward. Her casual comments, the way she laughed when she thought I wasn't looking, even the small signs of guilt or lack thereof were clues in the map I was building. I began to understand her thought process, her impulses, and the predictable rhythm of her actions. It was like uncovering a secret code, each theft revealing a little more about her personality and patterns. It was around this time that I decided to begin subtle countermeasures. Not direct confrontation, not gloating, but careful preparation. I began thinking about a special lunch, a controlled setup that could turn her own behavior into a trap. The idea wasn't impulsive. It was the culmination of weeks of observation and careful planning. Emma's overconfidence, her habitual disregard for boundaries, and her predictability had all set the stage for a situation where her actions could be exposed in a way that was undeniable. Every day became an exercise in observation and calculation. I noted the exact times she tended to raid the kitchen, the order in which she took items, and even the way she left traces: crumbs, open packages, empty wrappers that could serve as evidence later. It was almost like assembling a puzzle, each piece revealing more of the overall picture, and each piece bringing me closer to the moment when I could reclaim control. I also began experimenting with small tests, leaving decoy items that she would inevitably take. Each successful test reinforced my understanding of her behavior. She never resisted, never hesitated, never doubted her entitlement. It was clear that her audacity had become a habit, and habits, I realized, can be anticipated and leveraged. My helplessness had taught me patience, and patience was becoming my greatest weapon. The red flags were not just about her behavior. They were about her mindset. She believed she could act without consequence, that her casual jokes and dismissive attitude would shield her from accountability. Every laugh, every shrug, every stolen bite reinforced that belief. And every one of these moments, carefully observed and recorded, was now a thread in the web. I was beginning to weave a web that would eventually reveal the truth she thought she could hide. It wasn't just about strategy. It was about understanding psychology. I realized that Emma's confidence was her weakness. She had no reason to believe anyone was paying attention. She assumed that months of theft and casual disrespect would go unnoticed, that her behavior was invisible, consequence-free. And in that assumption lay the opportunity. By carefully documenting everything, by understanding her patterns, I could create a scenario where her own actions would deliver the consequences she had long ignored. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. I was no longer entirely helpless. I had the knowledge, the observations, and the patience to orchestrate a situation where she would meet the outcome she had unknowingly prepared for herself. The helplessness of the past weeks had transformed into anticipation, a quiet but growing excitement at the prospect of finally turning the tables. I continued observing, day by day, hour by hour, cataloging every detail. Her predictable raids, her preferences, her casual disregard for my space, they all became critical data points. I wasn't just waiting for the next theft anymore. I was preparing for it, laying the foundation for a carefully planned trap. Every small theft, every laugh, every shrug, was now an instrument in the larger design, each one bringing me closer to a moment where her behavior could no longer be denied or ignored. By the end of the third week, the picture was clear. Emma's audacity, her predictability, her casual sense of entitlement, had all set the stage. I had learned her rhythm, her patterns, and her weaknesses. The red flags weren't just signs of theft, they were signals, warnings, and guides for the plan that was slowly taking shape. I could see the moment approaching when the helplessness of the past would give way to control. strategy, and the ultimate payoff, and as I lay awake that night, replaying every observation, every stolen snack, every casual grin she had thrown my way, I felt the first spark of anticipation. The discovery trail had been painstakingly mapped, the evidence gathered, the patterns memorized. Emma had no idea what was coming. She thought her behavior was consequence-free. She thought I was helpless. She had no idea that her overconfidence, her disregard for boundaries, and her habitual theft had all been preparing the stage for the reckoning. She didn't yet see by the beginning of the 4th week. Everything had been carefully observed, noted, and catalogued. Emma's behavior had become predictable in ways I could almost anticipate down to the minute. The late-night raids, the choice of my favorite snacks, the way she lingered in the kitchen with that casual grin, every single action had been studied and mentally logged. What once left me feeling helpless now gave me a blueprint. The helplessness I had endured for weeks had transformed into the foundation of a plan, and it was time to act. I started small, experimenting with decoy items to see how she would react, confirming the patterns I had documented. True to form, she took the bait every single time, completely unaware that her actions were being watched and catalogued. It was almost as if she were performing a routine she had perfected over months, one that gave her confidence and reinforced her belief that she could act without consequence. Every bite she took, every chocolate bar she absconded with, was a signal, a piece of evidence that would later play a crucial role in the trap I was setting. The first step in creating the perfect setup involved selecting the items she couldn't resist. I knew exactly what would draw her in: the chocolate-covered granola bars she devoured in secret, the little cheese slices she hoarded, even the neatly packed sandwiches I had made after work. Each item was chosen deliberately, placed strategically, and timed perfectly to catch her in a moment when she would act without thinking. The goal wasn't just to feed her hunger, it was to manipulate her behavior in a way that would reveal everything she had been doing for months. Preparation required patience. I cleaned the kitchen meticulously, rearranged the shelves to make my items more visible, and even prepared a few extra enticing treats to see if she would take them. Every detail mattered. Even the placement of a single chocolate bar or a sandwich could determine whether the trap would succeed or fail. I had learned that impulsive or careless actions were her weakness, and I intended to use them to full effect. I also spent hours considering her mindset, replaying her past reactions in my mind. She had always laughed off my protests, always turned my frustration into a joke, always assumed that her audacity would go unchallenged. That overconfidence was her greatest vulnerability. By constructing a scenario where her predictability would work against her, I could ensure the payoff without direct confrontation. She would set herself up, unaware that she was stepping into a situation designed to expose her behavior conclusively. Days passed as I refined the setup. I prepared the special lunch, a combination of items she loved, and left them in places where she would inevitably find them. The kitchen became a stage, every shelf and counter carefully arranged to guide her actions. The air in the apartment felt charged with anticipation. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of control I hadn't experienced since this ordeal began. The trap was not just about food, it was about reclaiming my space, my authority, and my sense of dignity. The day I decided to set the trap, I was meticulous. Each item was placed exactly where it would catch her attention, timed to coincide with her predictable late-night habits. I imagined her movements, her casual grin, the way she would assume she had free reign over my carefully prepared items. Every detail had been anticipated, every reaction mapped out mentally. It was almost cinematic, the calm before the storm, the tension building quietly in the background as the plan silently came together. Even as I carried out the setup, I remained calm. Patience had been my greatest ally throughout this ordeal. Rushing or acting impulsively would ruin everything. I reminded myself that the success of this plan depended on observation, timing, and subtlety. The helplessness that had dominated the previous weeks had transformed into quiet, deliberate anticipation. I knew exactly what had to happen for the trap to work, and I was prepared to wait for the precise moment. I left the items out in plain view, making sure they were tempting enough to ensure she wouldn't resist. Every granola bar, every chocolate treat, every sandwich was part of the narrative I had constructed. Each one was bait, designed not only to entice her, but also to document her predictable behavior. By the time she acted, I would have a clear record of her thefts, her disregard for boundaries, and her overconfidence. That evening, I observed silently from a distance. Emma entered the kitchen, her casual air masking the fact that she had no idea what was coming. She scanned the shelves, her eyes locking on the items I had deliberately placed for her. Her grin appeared instantly, the one I had seen countless times before when she assumed she was getting away with something. But this time, everything was different. I was watching, waiting, and ready. The trap was set. She moved with predictable precision, taking the items she desired, arranging them on the counter, completely unaware that her every action had been anticipated. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. The helplessness of the past weeks had vanished, replaced by the quiet power of knowing that her behavior was about to meet consequences in a way she could not escape. As she finished taking what she wanted, I stepped closer, casually observing, without giving any indication, that I had been waiting for this moment for weeks. Every subtle action she had performed, every habit she had displayed, was now documented in my mind. The trap was working perfectly. The carefully constructed scenario had successfully manipulated her predictable behavior, and I could feel the tension building toward the inevitable revelation. I allowed her to continue for a few more minutes, giving her the illusion of freedom and control. Every moment reinforced her overconfidence. Every gesture confirmed the pattern I had spent weeks observing. The suspense was almost unbearable. I felt a strange thrill, knowing that all her small acts of theft and casual disregard were leading to a moment she could not control. A moment where the tables would finally turn. By the end of the evening, I had everything in place. The stage was set, the bait was consumed, and the anticipation had reached its peak. Emma had unknowingly fallen into the scenario I had carefully orchestrated, and the next steps would reveal her actions in full, undeniable clarity. Months of helplessness, frustration, and observation had culminated in this moment, the point where patience and strategy would finally deliver justice. As I cleaned up subtly, leaving just enough evidence to ensure the plan would succeed, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The trap was no longer hypothetical, it was real, unfolding in front of me exactly as I had predicted. Emma had played her part perfectly, unknowingly performing every action I had counted on, and the payoff was imminent. For the first time in months, I felt in control, confident that the reckoning she had long avoided was about to arrive. And in that quiet anticipation, I realized something profound. The helplessness of the past weeks had not been wasted. It had honed my observation, strengthened my patience, and prepared me for the moment when months of violation and disregard would finally meet consequences she could not escape. The next morning felt heavier than usual, like the apartment itself knew what was coming. I woke up earlier than Emma for the first time in weeks, my mind clear, steady, and oddly calm. The trap had been set the night before, perfectly arranged, like a quiet storm waiting for its cue. All I had to do today was guide the moment, let her own habits expose her, and watch everything unfold exactly the way she had forced it to be. The special lunch sat in the fridge like a loaded secret. I had packed it meticulously, every item sealed, labeled, layered, and placed so deliberately that even the most oblivious roommate couldn't miss it. It wasn't poison or anything dangerous. That was never the point. It was a combination of flavors Emma absolutely adored but reacted horribly to: dairy-heavy sauces, spicy dressings, and ingredients I knew for a fact tore her stomach apart. I wasn't aiming to harm her. I was aiming to give her a very personal reminder of boundaries she had ignored for months. A direct hit to the one thing she had taken from me over and over. She had messed with my food. Now, my food would mess with her. I placed my lunch bag at the perfect angle on the middle shelf of the fridge, the one she always rummaged through, even though she had her own shelf on top. I could almost visualize her opening the door, seeing the bag, thinking she was the smartest person alive, and casually stealing it as if it were her right. I didn't have to coach her behavior, she had rehearsed it for months. As I got ready for work, I moved slowly around the apartment, my ears tuned to her footsteps. When she finally stumbled out of her room, I knew instantly by the sound. Emma walked like someone who had never been in a rush, a day in her life, lazy, uneven footsteps, dragging slippers, and a dramatic morning yawn that shook the whole hallway. She stretched loudly, opened the fridge, and paused. I stood behind the wall, toothbrush in hand, listening to the moment. Her eyes landed on the bag. There was a beat of silence. Then, the sound of plastic rustling, a satisfied hum. She had taken the bait. I felt the corner of my mouth lift, not in amusement, but in the quiet acknowledgement that months of frustration had finally begun to shift in my favor. The execution had officially begun. I stepped into the kitchen casually, pretending I had just woken up. Emma was leaning against the counter with my lunch bag open in front of her, already peeling back the wrapper of the sandwich I had crafted specifically with her weaknesses in mind. She froze for a fraction of a second, not out of guilt, but out of calculation. She was trying to judge how much I had seen. "Oh, hey," she said quickly, flashing her usual fake innocence. "You don't mind if I take one of your sandwiches, right?" I overslept. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let the silence wrap around her, heavy and uncomfortable. She shifted her weight. I'll replace it later. You know how it is." I knew exactly how it was. I had known for months. But today, it wasn't my job to argue with her. She would argue for me, her own body would. I grabbed a cup of water, acting unbothered. "Go ahead," I said smoothly. "Help yourself." That single sentence was enough to disarm her completely. She relaxed, shrugged, and took a big bite of the sandwich. She closed her eyes dramatically, savoring the taste. "This is really good," she mumbled through a full mouth. "You make the best stuff. I don't know how you do it." I almost laughed. If only she knew. Over the next hour, I watched her casually pack the rest of my lunch into her bag: chips, fruit cup, dessert, all things she had stolen countless times before. She wasn't even trying to hide it now. Her arrogance was a beast that fed itself. The moment she left the apartment, I finally let out a slow breath. Phase 1 was complete. Phase 2 was waiting for her at work. I arrived at the office around noon, and my phone buzzed just as I stepped inside. It was a message from Emma. "Hey, so that sandwich you made was amazing, but my stomach is doing something weird, Lamau. Did you use a new brand or something?" I put my phone away. She had no idea what she had walked into. Bypm. I got the second message. "Dude, WF, my stomach is cramping. I feel like I swallowed lava. Did you put hot sauce in it?" I didn't reply. 10 minutes later, I'm in the bathroom. "This is not funny. What did you put in that food?" Her panic came through the text like a siren. I wasn't celebrating her pain, not even for a second. I wasn't cruel, but I was relieved that the consequences were finally catching up to her. After months of disrespect, entitlement, and blatant theft, the universe had a way of balancing things out when people push their luck too far. At 2 around PM, she video called me. I didn't answer. She called again. Same result. Then she sent a selfie from the bathroom stall, red-faced, sweating, eyes wide with regret, mascara smudging as she tried to glare at the camera. You need to call me now. I think I'm dying. She wasn't dying. She was experiencing a combination of dairy, spicy mayo, and garlic aioli, all things I avoided because I had mild allergies. But she absolutely could not handle. I finally texted back. I packed that lunch for myself. Why did you eat it? She didn't reply for 3 minutes. Then, can you please come pick me up? I can't walk. I feel like my stomach is exploding. I stared at the message. The same girl who stole from me without guilt, mocked me when I complained, and acted like my belongings belonged to her, was now begging for help. It wasn't surprising. People like Emma often crumbled the moment their actions came back to haunt them. I typed my response slowly. You stole my food. Again. Now you're dealing with the consequences. Stop blaming me. She typed back immediately. Okay, I'm sorry. Just please come. Please. For the first time since she became my roommate. She sounded genuinely desperate, not manipulative, not smug, not dismissive, just scared and uncomfortable. But I didn't leave work. I didn't bail her out. I didn't rush to rescue her from the mess she created. She had crossed that line too many times to expect me to fix anything for her now. When I got home later that evening, the apartment was silent. Emma was curled up on the couch, pale, exhausted, and visibly drained from hours of stomach pain. She looked up at me with red, watery eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered weakly. I shouldn't have taken your lunch, or your food, or anything. I know it's my fault. For a moment, I saw a glimpse of someone who understood consequences. Someone who wasn't used to facing them but couldn't escape them now. The execution had worked. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't mocking or arrogant. She was humbled. And that was the whole point. The trap had been set, triggered, and completed. The power had quietly shifted without a single argument or lecture. She had finally realized that her actions mattered, and that consequences didn't care about excuses. As she lay there recovering, I walked to the fridge, took a fresh bottle of water, and sat across from her silently. She avoided my eyes, too embarrassed to even speak. For the first time since she moved in, I felt something shift in the air. She finally understood. Tomorrow would bring the big confrontation, the moment where truths would be spoken out loud. But for now, the execution had done exactly what it needed to do. The morning after the special lunch, the apartment felt different. It wasn't quieter or louder. It was charged, almost electric, as if the air itself had absorbed the tension from the previous day. Emma moved around like someone stepping on fragile glass, careful, hesitant, her usual confidence replaced by an awkward awareness she had never shown before. I could see it in the way she lingered near the fridge, not daring to touch anything. The way she avoided my gaze entirely. Her phone buzzed constantly with apologies and frantic messages, though she mostly ignored them, too embarrassed or too uncomfortable to respond. I didn't intervene. This was the aftermath of her own making, the first time she had confronted real consequences for months of casual theft, disregard, and mockery. Every step she took in the apartment seemed measured now, every movement deliberate. Even the smallest gesture, reaching for a cup or adjusting a plate, felt like she was testing boundaries she had never respected before. When she finally looked at me, it was tentative, her eyes wide, almost pleading. I didn't think it would. I'm sorry, she mumbled, trailing off. I didn't respond immediately. There was no need. Her words were already evidence of the shift, proof that the message had finally landed. For months, she had mocked boundaries, laughed at rules, and treated my food as if it had no owner. Now she was humbled, visibly and painfully aware that her actions had consequences. The full reaction came slowly, almost like watching a chain reaction unfold. Emma alternated between apologetic mutterings and panic pacing, unsure of how to process the embarrassment and discomfort she had brought upon herself. She avoided the kitchen entirely, standing at a distance as if it were a room she had no right to enter. I watched quietly, letting her realize, in her own time, that her behavior had caught up with her. This wasn't punishment, it was a mirror reflecting every moment of audacity she had displayed. I noticed her expressions shift subtly: frustration, regret, confusion. Her pride, which had carried her through months of taking what wasn't hers, was finally cracking. For the first time, she had to face the reality that no one else would bail her out, that casual mockery and disregard couldn't shield her from consequences forever. It was fascinating to observe, almost cinematic. The transformation from smug entitlement to humility. By mid-morning, she had finally mustered the courage to approach the fridge again, this time with hesitation and a small, awkward smile. I think I need to eat something that isn't yours, she said quietly, avoiding eye contact. The tremor in her voice was undeniable. She had been forced to acknowledge boundaries she had ignored for months. I handed her a small, untouched snack from her own shelf without a word. The silence between us was heavy, but it was necessary. She needed to experience the full weight of her actions, to internalize the lessons she had long avoided. Her previous behavior had been fueled by ignorance, arrogance, and the certainty of consequence-free living. Now, with no lectures, no shouting, just the aftermath of her choices, she was processing for the first time how much she had taken for granted. Her reaction wasn't immediate, and it wasn't simple. There were moments of relief, moments of regret, moments where she seemed almost paralyzed by embarrassment. Each time I observed her hesitation, I understood that months of casual theft and mockery had finally met the inevitable, personal accountability. It wasn't punishment delivered by me. It was the natural result of her own behavior colliding with reality. She kept apologizing throughout the day, though not all at once. Small bursts of regret, interspersed with pauses, reflective silences, and the occasional nervous laugh. I didn't realize. I'm so sorry, she said repeatedly, trying to articulate the remorse she felt but struggling to find words adequate enough to capture the weight of her misdeeds. I didn't offer reassurance. She had to feel it for herself. It became clear that the special lunch had achieved its purpose beyond mere embarrassment. It had forced her to experience a consequence she couldn't evade, to confront the discomfort that comes when habitual disrespect finally meets its mirror. Every ping of her stomach, every wave of humiliation, every awkward movement in the kitchen was now a lesson etched into memory. A visceral understanding of boundaries and ownership. By evening, the full reaction had evolved into a mixture of humility and reflection. She moved slowly, quietly, acknowledging the spaces and items that weren't hers. She started asking permission for things she would have previously taken without a second thought. Her once casual entitlement had been replaced with caution, respect, and a newfound awareness of the impact her actions had on others. For the first time, she was seeing the world not only through her own lens, but through the consequences of her behavior. I watched her quietly, noting every subtle change, the way she paused before opening the fridge, the way she kept her hands away from my containers, the way she lingered in the living room instead of assuming dominance over shared spaces. Months of audacity had culminated in this, a moment of clarity forced upon her not by confrontation, but by the consequences of her own choices. By the end of the day, Emma had begun to speak differently as well. Her apologies were more considered, less frantic, more genuine. She started acknowledging my presence with subtle respect, asking before taking anything, and even commenting on the fairness of boundaries she had long ignored. The shift was remarkable, not sudden, but undeniable. Her reaction had evolved from panic and embarrassment to a tentative understanding of accountability. For the first time, I felt the weight of control returning to me, not through argument or force, but through the natural unfolding of consequences. Emma had lived in a bubble of entitlement for months, and now that bubble had burst. Watching her navigate the aftermath was a strange mix of relief, satisfaction, and quiet vindication. The helplessness of prior weeks had been replaced with anticipation and observation, and now the moment of reckoning had fully arrived. The apartment felt different that night, not because of tension or conflict, but because of a subtle recalibration. The energy that had been dominated by her audacity and my frustration was shifting into equilibrium. Emma had finally learned, in the most personal way, that boundaries existed for a reason, that casual theft and disregard carry consequences, and that repeated behavior has a way of catching up with even the most confident of people. I sat quietly in the living room, watching her organize her own shelf of snacks, meticulously placing everything where it belonged, taking care not to repeat past mistakes. The reaction had been complete. She was humbled, reflective, and beginning to internalize the lessons she had long avoided. The trap I had set had worked flawlessly, not through aggression or confrontation, but through careful observation, patience, and strategy. The full reaction wasn't just about embarrassment or discomfort, it was about recognition. Emma recognized, finally, that her behavior had consequences that could not be wished away. She recognized, finally, that boundaries matter. And most importantly, she recognized that I had the awareness, patience, and control to reclaim my space without resorting to confrontation or conflict. As I turned off the lights that night, I felt a quiet sense of closure. The execution had been clean, precise, and entirely effective. Emma's reaction, the culmination of weeks of careful planning and observation, had achieved what months of frustration, argument, and subtle warning could not. The helplessness I had endured had given way to strategy, and the strategy had produced undeniable results. Tomorrow would bring conversations, apologies, and rebuilding of trust. But tonight was the night where the lesson had been felt, lived, and understood in the most personal way possible. Emma had crossed a line, and the full reaction had ensured she would never forget it. The day after the full reaction, the apartment felt lighter, almost serene. There was a calm that had never existed before, a quiet acknowledgement that the balance had shifted. Emma moved around cautiously, slower than usual, as if she was navigating territory she had long taken for granted, but now realized she didn't truly own. Every gesture, every glance, every step carried the weight of recognition, the recognition that she had crossed boundaries, and that boundaries, once enforced, could not be ignored. The shift in power wasn't abrupt or confrontational, it was subtle, earned, and undeniable. Emma approached the kitchen with hesitation, her previous confidence replaced by awareness and respect. She paused before touching anything, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of apology and cautious acknowledgement. The arrogance that had dominated our apartment for months had been replaced by humility. She was finally aware that her actions had consequences, and that the control she had assumed over my space was gone. For months, she had acted with impunity. Each stolen snack, each casually taken sandwich, had been a tiny assertion of dominance, a small act that chipped away at my sense of security and ownership. But the trap I had set, the carefully planned lunch, the predictable setup, the observation and timing had reversed the dynamic. She was no longer in control. The audacity that had fueled her behavior had collided with consequences in a way she could not ignore, could not manipulate, and could not laugh off. Emma's attempts to explain herself, her flustered apologies, and the way she carefully navigated shared spaces all highlighted the shift. The casual entitlement that had once defined her behavior was gone. In its place was awareness, understanding, and the beginnings of respect. For the first time, she saw that boundaries existed not as arbitrary rules, but as a framework for fairness and mutual respect, something she had ignored at her own peril. I watched as she meticulously organized her shelf of snacks, placing items back in their proper containers, labeling them when necessary, and even asking before touching certain things. Every act was a small assertion of the new power dynamic. Hers had diminished, mine had been restored. The apartment, once a battlefield of small thefts and passive-aggressive tension, now carried a subtle, almost imperceptible harmony. It was a quiet justice, not loud or vindictive, but undeniable in its clarity. The psychological shift was profound. Emma's demeanor had changed completely. She was more thoughtful, cautious, and reflective. Every action she took was now measured against the knowledge that her choices carried consequences. For months, she had assumed her behavior was consequence-free, that she could act with audacity without ever having to face accountability. Now, the lesson had been internalized. She had felt the result of her actions firsthand, and the humility it produced was both immediate and lasting. Even our interactions shifted. Where there had once been casual mockery and dismissive laughter, there was now careful conversation, polite acknowledgement, and a clear understanding of boundaries. The power dynamic had been rewritten without a single argument, without a shouting match, and without any forced compliance. Emma had learned, in the most personal way possible, that actions matter, boundaries exist, and control is earned through respect, not assumed through habit. The justice was not theatrical. It was quiet, deliberate, and complete. It wasn't about revenge for the sake of satisfaction. It wasn't about proving superiority or belittling someone. It was about reestablishing balance, restoring respect, and ensuring that repeated violations of trust could no longer occur. Emma's realization was genuine, her behavior permanently altered by the consequences she had faced. Over the next few days, she continued to demonstrate the shift. She asked before taking anything from the fridge, she returned items she had used without permission, and she even started leaving small notes of acknowledgement for shared items. The apartment had transformed from a space of constant tension to one of quiet cooperation. The small acts of respect she now displayed were proof that the power shift was real, that justice had been enacted without force, and that the consequences of her prior behavior were fully understood. It was remarkable to watch the full transformation unfold. The same roommate who had dominated the apartment with casual theft and disregard was now navigating space with careful awareness. Every glance, every step, every small action reflected the lesson she had learned through experience. She was no longer untouchable, no longer unchallenged, and no longer the person who had assumed her audacity could go unchecked. The sense of satisfaction I felt wasn't about triumphing over her. It was about reclaiming my life, my space, and my sense of dignity. Months of frustration and helplessness had culminated in this moment of clarity and balance. The lessons she had learned were profound because they had been lived, not lectured. The trap, carefully set and patiently executed, had done its work, and the justice that emerged was complete in its quiet power. By the end of the week, Emma's behavior had stabilized. She had internalized the consequences of her actions, and the subtle power shift between us was undeniable. She moved in the apartment with a new understanding, a newfound respect, and a cautious awareness that boundaries are not optional. The tension that had defined our interactions for months had dissipated, replaced with a quiet equilibrium. I realized then that justice doesn't always require confrontation, shouting, or dramatic retaliation. Sometimes it comes from observation, strategy, and patience. Sometimes it comes from allowing consequences to unfold naturally, letting someone face the results of their actions in a way that is both undeniable and transformative. Emma had learned her lesson the hard way, but the lesson had taken root. The power shift wasn't about fear or intimidation, it was about recognition. She recognized the validity of boundaries, the consequences of repeated violations, and the necessity of respect in shared spaces. I recognized my own strength, patience, and the ability to reclaim control without aggression. And most importantly, the apartment had finally become a place where fairness and consideration were no longer optional, but expected and respected. As I settled into the evening, watching Emma move about the apartment with newfound awareness, I felt a sense of closure. The months of violation, frustration, and helplessness had finally reached their conclusion. Justice had been enacted, power had shifted, and the lessons of consequence had been internalized. The apartment, once a battleground of small thefts and subtle manipulation, was now a space of quiet equilibrium, proof that strategy, patience, and observation could achieve more than confrontation ever could. For the first time in months, I felt at peace in my own home. The boundaries I had fought to enforce were respected. The helplessness I had endured had been transformed into strategy. And the roommate who had once dominated with audacity had learned to navigate with humility. The justice was complete, the power had shifted, and the lesson had been learned. The apartment felt different now. It wasn't louder, brighter, or cleaner. It was calmer, steadier, and somehow lighter, like the air itself had absorbed the tension that had defined the past months. Emma moved carefully, deliberately, aware of every action she took, every shelf she touched, every container she opened. The audacity, entitlement, and casual disregard that had once filled the apartment were gone. In their place was a quiet awareness, a sense of boundaries finally understood, and a subtle but unmistakable respect. Watching her move about the kitchen, I realized just how much had changed, not in dramatic, obvious ways, but in small, tangible shifts. She asked before touching anything, paused to make sure she wasn't overstepping, and even started labeling some of her own items. It was almost surreal to witness the transformation. The same roommate who had once taken my food without a second thought, who had laughed at my protests, was now cautious, reflective, and for the first time, accountable. The reflection wasn't just about Emma. I thought about my own journey over the past few weeks, the frustration, the helplessness, the constant vigilance, and the mental energy it had taken to track every small theft and subtle gesture. But that frustration had transformed into patience, strategy, and quiet empowerment. The helplessness I had felt had taught me observation and resilience. It had forced me to think carefully, to anticipate, and to act deliberately. And in the end, those lessons had produced results far more satisfying than confrontation or anger ever could. I remembered the special lunch, the way it had executed the plan without drama, and the subtle shift that had begun the moment Emma took the first bite. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about justice. It was about showing someone the consequences of repeated, careless actions in a way they could not deny or manipulate. And it had worked. Emma's reaction, the humility she now displayed, and her careful attention to boundaries were proof that the method had been effective, even after the immediate shock and embarrassment had passed. The aftermath lingered in a way that felt almost tangible. Emma now approached shared spaces differently, spoke differently, and even apologized preemptively for actions she might have previously dismissed. Her understanding of accountability, respect, and the value of boundaries had deepened in a way that words alone could not have achieved. She had experienced the consequences personally, and the lesson had been internalized. The power dynamic had shifted permanently. Where once she had acted with confidence, entitlement, and casual disregard, she now moved cautiously, aware that actions have outcomes and that repeated violations carry consequences. It wasn't fear that guided her behavior, it was understanding. She had learned the limits, recognized my boundaries, and began to navigate our shared space with thoughtfulness and care. The subtle, almost invisible shift in power was complete, and it brought a sense of equilibrium to the apartment that had been absent for months. I reflected on the psychological lessons embedded in this ordeal. Patience, observation, and strategy could achieve more than confrontation or anger. People often fail to recognize the consequences of their actions until they experience them directly. By allowing Emma to face the natural outcome of her repeated disregard, I had created a scenario where she could not deny her mistakes. The experience had forced accountability, reflection, and ultimately change without the need for shouting, lecturing, or prolonged conflict. There were moments when I considered how easy it would have been to act impulsively, to scold her, throw away her items, or confront her immediately. But every time I imagined those scenarios, I realized they wouldn't have had the lasting impact the plan produced. Confrontation might have triggered temporary compliance, but it wouldn't have created the internal understanding that now existed. The effectiveness lay in patience, anticipation, and letting consequences unfold naturally. Over the following days, Emma's behavior remained consistently different. She was cautious, considerate, and at times, apologetic in ways she hadn't been before. She started organizing her items, asking permission, and taking care not to overstep boundaries she had once ignored. These changes were subtle but unmistakable, a tangible proof that lessons learned through lived experience are far more impactful than lessons imposed externally. I also reflected on the personal growth I had experienced through this ordeal. The months of frustration, observation, and careful planning had taught me patience, strategic thinking, and emotional control. I had learned to anticipate behavior, design solutions, and reclaim my space without resorting to aggression or confrontation. What began as helplessness had evolved into empowerment, and the results were visible in both Emma's behavior and my own sense of control. There were still moments of quiet satisfaction as I observed Emma navigating our shared space. Every small act of respect, every careful gesture, every acknowledgement of boundaries, was a reminder of how far we had come. The apartment, once a source of tension and stress, had become a place of subtle balance. The lessons had been learned, the power had shifted, and a sense of order had been restored. I thought about how easily this scenario could have spiraled into conflict. Months of tension, unchecked behavior, and casual disregard might have led to arguments, resentment, or even a toxic environment. But the approach I had chosen, strategic, patient, and deliberate, had transformed potential conflict into clarity and understanding. Justice had been achieved not through anger, but through design and anticipation. The reflection also made me consider the importance of boundaries in everyday life. Emma had learned through experience that entitlement without consideration has consequences. I had learned that patience and strategy often yield results more lasting than immediate reaction. And together, we had both discovered that shared spaces, mutual respect, and accountability are essential, not just for coexistence, but for harmony. By the end of the week, the apartment felt entirely different. The tension that had dominated interactions for months had dissipated. Emma's behavior had permanently shifted. She moved through shared spaces with awareness, spoke with consideration, and respected the boundaries that had once been irrelevant to her. The lessons of the ordeal had left an indelible mark, and the subtle power dynamic had settled into balance. As I reflected quietly that night, I felt a deep sense of closure. Months of violation, frustration, and helplessness had culminated in a series of deliberate, measured actions that restored balance and understanding. Emma had faced consequences she could not evade, internalized the lessons, and demonstrated behavior that reflected the growth that had taken place. The apartment was no longer a battlefield. It was a space where respect, accountability, and careful consideration governed interactions. The helplessness I had endured had been transformed into strategy. The trap I had set had revealed truths, and the consequences had brought about reflection and change. Justice had been served, power had shifted, and harmony had been restored. And as I lay back that night, listening to the quiet rhythm of the apartment, I realized something important. Sometimes the most effective lessons aren't delivered through confrontation, shouting, or punishment. They're learned through experience, anticipation, and the natural consequences of one's own actions. Emma had learned hers. I had reclaimed my space, and the balance we now shared would not be so easily disrupted again.